in a war, Iran would use asymmetrical warfare. Israel and the United States have military dominance. They may not be able to win this war, okay? How much did it cost the Israelis to defend themselves against this attack? Okay, it was at least $1 billion. Okay, do you understand? All right? This shows us that in a war, Iran would use asymmetrical warfare. Israel and the United States have military dominance. They may not be able to win this war, okay? The Iranians will use this asymmetrical warfare strategy against the Americans. And so shouldn't the Americans respond with more strategic thinking? And that's a great question. And the answer is the Americans would not do that. Why not? Why is it that asymmetrical warfare is so effective against empires and dominant military powers? What's a problem of empires usually? What is the fatal flaw? Okay, they have too much bureaucracy, but Iran also has bureaucracy. But the empires have a much bigger problem, okay? Now let's go back to the Millennium Challenge. Now, in the first test, in the first battle, Iran won against the United States, right? So what did the United States do? And do what? They did a second simulation. In the second simulation, what did they do? Exactly, okay? What the Americans said is, nope, this is cheating, guys. Did you understand? Asymmetrical warfare is cheating. You cannot cheat. And then the Americans won. Does that make sense? Okay? So remember, in the first instance where you are allowed to use asymmetrical warfare, the Iranians won. In the second instance, the Americans said, no, asymmetrical warfare is cheating. So you're not allowed to use asymmetrical warfare. You must fight us directly. And the Americans won. What does this tell us about the American military? They are inflexible. Empires are inflexible. And the reason why is the idea of hubris. If you're an empire, you refuse to admit your failings and faults. You become very stubborn, okay? So it's back to the example of Jack has his machine gun, his armor, right? He comes in the dark forest thinking like, I'm invincible, right? And like everyone's like, Jack, don't go into that dark forest. It's stupid. But Jack's like, no, I have a machine gun. I don't care. So that's the situation. That's why asymmetrical warfare is so effective, because it allows you flexibility and creativity, and the empire, the dominant power, refuses to be flexible and creative. And so the classic example of this is Vietnam, where the Vietnamese were clearly dominated by the Americans, but the Vietnamese were using extremely creative and flexible tactics against Americans, whereas the Americans insisted on their main military doctrine. If the Iranians are going to use asymmetrical warfare, what would it look like? And the answer is this. When the Americans invade, before the invasion, the Iranians must do 4 things if it is to prevail in the war, okay? And this is what we call the Iran strategy matrix. The Iran strategy matrix means that from now on, everything they do must fit into the strategy matrix, okay? It must accomplish the objectives of the strategy matrix. So the first thing it must do is unite the population. Second thing it must do is build alliances. And the third thing is win global opinion. And the fourth is weaken the enemy. So in other words, everything that Iran is going to do from now until the actual invasion will be to accomplish all 4 goals at once. And it must, if it is to survive a full-scale American invasion, okay? So unite the population. What does this mean? Okay? It means that you win the war depending on how much your population is willing to resist the invasion. It turns out that even though the Iranians right now are divided, okay, there's a lot of opposition towards the current government in Iran. As some of you know, there have been some protests over the past few years, women protesting for more rights in Iran, okay? So there's a lot of division in that country. But I think that most Iranians would resist an invasion. And the reason why is that the Iranians have a very bad history with Westerners, okay? So the example is the 1953 coup d'etat. So what happened is that in 1909, the British discovered oil in Iran. It was called Persia back then. And so they created a company called the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, which we now know as British Petroleum, okay, BP. And the idea is that this company would be responsible for extracting and selling all the oil. But unfortunately, the deal was that Iran, Persia, would only get 16% of profits. So the Iranians are very upset about this. It's their oil, it's their resource, but they're not getting that much money out of it, okay? It's basically stealing. So for decades, the Iranians have been trying to renegotiate the deal. In 1953, the democratically elected government of Iran said to the British, listen, let's do 50-50, okay? That's fair, 50-50. 50% for us, 50% for you, right? That's a fair deal. And the British, instead of saying yes, went to the Americans, and the British and the Americans together launched a coup d'etat against the democratically elected government of Iran and installed a police state called the Shah, which is like the monarchy, okay? And the Shah, the king of Iran, was so brutal that he created a police state. In 1979, the Iranian people overthrew the Shah, okay? And so the Iranian people do not like the idea of foreign invadors coming in and controlling the resource, okay? So over time, as Israel and as America continues to be aggressive towards Iran, the population will start to coalesce and fight against the Americans, okay? So that's unite the population. Second is build alliances. Now, Iran has two layers of alliance. The first layer is called the axis of resistance, right? Which I asked you to research. And the axis of resistance includes the Shia militias in Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen. Okay? What's important to understand is that this is an alliance. They agree to fight together because they have common interests, which is to remain independent of American influence. But that does not mean that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Houthis take orders from Iran, okay? They're not controlled by Iran. Iran supports them militarily and financially, but Iran cannot completely control their behavior, okay? So the example is on October 7th, Hamas launched an attack against Israel, right? Which resulted in this war. And Iran says, we were not involved. And Israel says that can't be true because you control Hamas, all right? So that's the first layer of alliance. But what Iran needs to do, if it is to win the war, is also bring in Russia and China.